Hi, I'm Scott Moore, and you're watching the SMC Journal podcast, where it's all about performance engineering in IT today. So, what is the current state of DevOps, site reliability engineers, and observability? I've been looking at reports that have been released over the past few weeks, some of them in the past few days, that are addressing this. Different vendors have released reports, and I'm going to go back even as far as a 2021 report from Google today, but I wanted to just kind of analyze these reports, look at some of the findings along with you, and let's just kind of pull out some interesting details and how it relates to performance engineering for applications and infrastructure, whether it's in a DevOps, total DevOps culture, hybrid cultures, whatever. That's what we want to talk about today. And before we do, let's talk about our sponsors that make this episode possible. That includes my friends at Micro Focus, the makers of LoadRunner Professional, Enterprise, Cloud, and Developer. Performance matters, and LoadRunner has the largest community of practitioners, and you can join them at the community page, community.microfocus.com. Check out the LoadRunner family page on their microfocus.com site, as well as the performance playlist on YouTube. Scan that QR code and you can see that very easily. This episode is also sponsored by my friends at Keysight Technologies. Keysight owns Eggplant software, and Eggplant makes Eggplant Performance, and that is a load and performance testing tool that supports web, Citrix, and low-level TCP/IP protocols, complete with real-time monitoring and integrated test analysis. We're also sponsored by our friends at Supervisor. I hope you saw the episode of our podcast just a few episodes ago. We actually featured the founder, Laurie, of Supervisor, and he showed how their product works with a demo. So if you haven't seen that, make sure you catch up on the episodes. Stop losing money with a slow website, because with Supervisor, you can continuously track the performance of your code and website and your hosting. Predict site page load speed with higher volumes. They have an easy one-click load test solution, which you can find out more about at supervisor.com. And we can't forget my friends at Total Performance Consulting. Amit and his staff have the highest quality performance engineering, automation, QA, and development services possible. Been around since 2006, and they have hundreds of years of combined experience with performance engineering. They've helped lots of companies tackle their challenges, so they can help you too. And that includes application performance testing, performance analysis, remediation, infrastructure evaluation, monitoring, CI/CD pipelines, and many other services that will help your company get, keep, and extend your competitive edge. So thank you all for your support of the performance community and this show specifically. So let's get right into it. There are 4 reports that I'm going to be talking about. The first 2 have to do with SRE and DevOps state. The second 2 focus specifically on observability. Let's talk about the first 2. That would be the Google State of DevOps for 2021. Still waiting on 2022, which I hope that we're going to be getting very soon. And then in recent weeks, we've had a Dynatrace State of SRE report in 2022. And I have to say, I'm not going to be bringing up these reports and go screen by screen, line by line. These vendors have actually spent a lot of money surveying people and presenting these results to you. I want you to be able to download these for yourself and go through them. I'm just picking out certain things that I've observed, certain points that I want to make from these, and we don't have time to go through all of this detail. So I'm going to put links in the show notes, and the YouTube video notes would have all of these links, so you can go and download this yourself and look through it and come to your own conclusions. And maybe you already have these, we can go through these together. Maybe go pause the video, download them, and let's just kind of look at it, and then you can give me feedback on your thoughts of these reports, because I may have no stinking clue. The first one, though, is over a year old. I've been actually wanting to talk about this report since the first of the year, and I'm just now getting around to being able to do so. The Google State of DevOps for 2021 report was a survey of 32,000 people around the world. Google has the largest sample set of any of the reports that we've seen. So they have a well-rounded view of this. Some of the conclusions they've come up with don't necessarily match some of the other ones, line for line. Maybe it's just because they have more data points. But some of the interesting things. Now, this report doesn't focus on specifically performance engineering. And that's really what we care about here, right? So there's a lot of things I'm just kind of not honing in on that it actually cares a lot about. They talk in this report more about the state of the culture of DevOps, the state of the role of the site reliability engineer, how the team operates, how they prevent burnout, best practices around that. And so I'm not really, on this show, that's kind of outside of our scope, but there's a couple of things that do affect reliability of applications, scalability of applications, and performance of applications and infrastructure in some of the things that they point out here. So the first thing I want to point out is their documentation statement, which I'm glad to see, and this is actually reinforced in other documents as well that I've seen recently. Documentation is key to having a good DevOps organization and being able to spread this knowledge, but it doesn't go against Agile and the Agile Manifesto, which says we prefer running code over useless documentation. In other words, there was an emphasis to push documentation to the side starting around 2008, 2010, when a lot of companies adopted Agile. The code is the documentation. We don't have to do any requirements. We just let the developers do their thing. We write a couple of user stories. They don't necessarily have all the things in it, like performance and security requirements as part of a user story. And a lot of people got bit because there was a lack of good documentation. Now, Agile doesn't say we don't want any documentation. They want useful documentation. And I completely agree with that. There's no reason to write 400-page manuals that nobody's going to read. And I've been guilty of putting out some performance test reports that were fairly lengthy, but it was something that was actually required of me to do. I would prefer to give the green light, stop light, red light, green light, yellow light report. Heck, I'd just like to give a piece of paper that had a picture of a thumb going up or down, and just like turn the paper up or down depending on what I found with the test. And trust me, I've got it. But obviously that's a little too brief for some people. But useful documentation is what's being reinforced here, and I think that's the key, so that site reliability engineers can actually find problems, fix problems, document what they did, prevent those problems, reduce toil, and automate all of this together. So very happy to see that. They also talk about, since they've been tracking this, and the group specifically that's tracking this, just for context for those of you who might not know, for Google's cloud organization, they have a subset of people that are part of DORA, which is the DevOps Research and Assessment, or DevOps Research and Analysis, something like that. But that's what DORA are. So when you see a company say, we go by DORA metrics for our DevOps practice, that's what they mean, is they're really doing what Google has found to be the best practices across all of these organizations. They probably don't say best practices because that's probably not cool to say these days, but it's what they found that works best and what they see success looking like with what they call the elite and more mature advanced DevOps or companies that have adopted DevOps. So since they've been watching this since 2018, they have seen the elites, which are the most advanced, most mature, go from about 7% to in the 20s. The next report I'm going to talk about kind of confirms that, but it also, even for 2022, we're still in that infancy stage. Now, Google seems to think that up to like 40 to 50 something percent are either elite or very mature out of these 32,000 people, but I'm not sure that I'm seeing that in real life. I'm seeing a lot of immaturity in the market. I see a lot of title changes and role changes and people saying that we have DevOps, but in 2009 I saw a lot of companies saying we are agile, and that you get in there and they are anything but agile. And so there will be this hype cycle, there will be a relabeling, there will be a, oh my gosh, we did this wrong and this is what we're doing wrong, we need to fix, and then it will level out just like everything else, and then you'll have something that's a well-oiled machine eventually. But I just don't see that we're there yet. Another thing in this report is they have learned through everybody working from home and COVID that you can't just rely on one cloud provider anymore, that multi-cloud is going to be a necessity, and that the elite companies are moving that way. I like that because, as we've seen from a lot of outages over the last 12 to 18 months, a lot of them were single cloud dependent that take down multiple companies. And I think that resiliency is going to be key. And that's why, user experience and what we call digital experience monitoring, I think, is really important. And I think that digital experience monitoring application that's looking at your app from the eyes of a user needs to come from outside the cloud providers. So I know of one company, Catchpoint, who is not a sponsor, by the way, that actually monitors from their own servers that are placed on specific backbone areas and servers and regional places that are outside the cloud, so they can monitor the cloud. So even if Amazon goes down, they can tell you that Amazon's down, and you can see that from their site WebSee, WEBSEE.com, and it's kind of like Down Detector. So I'd recommend that you check that out. Another thing that came to mind when I read this report was about observability, that the really mature organizations have a lot of observability going on. They spend more time setting up their monitoring, coding around it, and making wise decisions on how much they do. But they also have a lot of different tools going on with a lot of different vendors. And I think that's the case everywhere. And it's not just open source tools, which they did find that most companies who are farther ahead use a lot of open source products, but they have a combination of all three. They have cloud service provider tools for observability. They have open source, and they mix that with some commercial tools as well. So that is another thing that we're seeing in the market today, is lots of vendors and lots of tools and an overwhelming number, and there's no real single pane of glass, although everybody seems to keep saying that they have that. So that's an issue for where I think DevOps and the SRE role really need to mature to get there. But it takes a lot of different views. I mean, you've got to have observability at now the code level, the infrastructure level, the API level, the microservice level, the user level. There's all those things to get in, and it takes a lot of things to monitor at the Kubernetes level, at the pod level, and now at the network level. So what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of observability going on, and it can be overwhelming, and it can be very expensive. There are now products out there that are designed to reduce the amount of logging, to reduce the cost of it, while still giving you the information that you need. And there's kind of a balancing act that you have to make for that. So those are the main points. I'm going to look back through here as I am looking at this. Another thing, cloud integration and CI/CD. That's what I wanted to mention, not cloud integration, because we've already talked about that. CI/CD. Most organizations who are doing DevOps well are doing continuous integration, but they're also doing continuous testing, and that indicates continuous performance, doesn't it? Well, that's really a question that I have, because that is actually not addressed in this report. So the only vendor that I know of that has made an emphasis on continuous performance testing is Tricentis and their Neoload product. Now, other companies have talked about the need to shift everything left, and we've heard that for now, 10 years, where everything's got to shift left. And like when I spoke to my buddy Mark Tomlinson, he said, at some point when you've shoved everything left, there's nothing on the right, there's nothing center, and there's nothing on the right. Everything's over here on the left, and we're all left, but that is the whole scope is left. Well, everything can't be packed into this room for the left. There still has to be some stuff on the right as well. And I think there's been an overemphasis on shifting left and what that really means and defining that. So that gets a little murky. But the point is, continuous performance has to be part of continuous everything else. Continuous functional testing, continuous security testing, and it needs to be automated. So I've been around automation so long, and many of you watching have too. We just assume everybody's automating everything right now, and you'd be surprised to find out how much stuff is still manual. And even groups who claim to be we're all DevOps still have a lot of toil to deal with. So that's why I say we're not exactly mature across the board these days, and we've still got a ways to go. So the 2021 report kind of revealed that, and also some additional challenges that came from the culture of working from home, burning out, how teams can help other members of the team that might be experiencing burnout, because you can work all you want to work at home these days and never get done if you really like to do it, but it's not necessarily wise to take that on. And so you have to have this balance there, and I think that was part of what they were saying in this, is that the SRE role, because there is so much they've got to do and think about and fix and automate, that they can burn out very quickly. And that was happening, I think, in some of the early stages. So I think there's been an effort to reduce that and make that better. And okay, the next report we're going to talk about is the Dynatrace State of SRE report for 2022. This is based on 450 SREs across a diverse range of industries, and involves the site reliability engineer as a discipline. So some of the key findings that I found out of this report is kind of what I thought. SRE is maturing if you compare it to 2018, but it's not quick enough. And the maturity of these practices has increased, and again, slowly shifting everything left. But how much can you realistically do, especially in very large enterprises, to shift some of that stuff left? I think there's a little bit of frustration going on with maybe some of the Fortune 500s because they can't do some of this stuff. They can't scale that model very well, so they have to do what works for them. And I think that's really what's coming next, is do what works for you, and don't be ashamed if it works for you, because you don't have to do everything Dora says to do. So maybe I'm the pessimist here, but I think there's some logic in that. Also, they found that service level objectives are the staple for SREs, but challenges exist to bring them out, and it can be a messy process, because what's happening is a lot of groups are saying, okay, well, we used to use APM, application performance monitoring tools, in production, and we were looking at certain metrics. We'll just take that and call those service level objectives. And in the world of the SRE, we have the SLIs, which are the service level indicators, which are the metrics you want to use, the service level objectives, which are not contractually you're obligated to meet, but it's something internally that you're trying to meet and something you're trying to define. And then there's service level agreements, which is contractually defined, and there are penalties involved. So SLOs are the thing that companies are trying to develop right now to determine their success. But the questions that you're asking when you move from APM to observability, which we'll talk about in a minute, those questions change. With APM, I want to know, how long does it take for this web page to load? What's the CPU doing? I'll put all that stuff together and I'll look at it and go, okay, well, this is too high. We probably need to do something about that. Maybe I'm getting alerts. And then there's some actions that I need to take, or tasks. With observability, it's more about how good is my system right now? How well am I? What's the system health? What's the application health? And those may be different metrics that we have to start with. And just trying to transpose things from an APM system into observability is not working very well. And the other thing that they talk about in this report is that what the SRE's role really is to do is reduce toil. And that means automation, and it's being done, but there's going to have to be a lot more of it. And AI is probably going to have to help do some of that for us in the future, because things are just getting too much of everything. So we're still early in adoption. Now, according to their report in Dynatrace, only 20% of groups are in like what Google would call the elite status. So Dynatrace calls them the advanced status. We have a mature SRE practice that has been in place for more than 5 years, and they're using advanced SRE principles. So think Google, Facebook, etc. And then they have another group that's about 40%, 42% that's in that we're almost there. We're continually advancing, but we're kind of not there yet. And then the rest. So I guess it kind of does agree with Google in that you have this 20 something percent now that's at the mature level, and together it's about 50 to 60% of the market. I don't know if I really agree with that, and I think maybe when you're surveying people, some people think they're more mature than they really are, and it's probably better to be more pessimistic when you're talking about that, because here's something that goes all the way back to CMM levels, right? You hear companies say, we're CMM level 5, Carnegie Mellon, whatever that maturity model is, and we accomplished it in 18 months. Okay, I don't want to work with that company. Why? Because the magic of getting to CMM level 5 is in the journey. It's not the destination. And someone who says, we have figured everything out in 18 months is like a 14-year-old kid telling you, I already know everything. I don't need to continue school. I don't need any college. I don't need any life experience. I can run everything and I know everything. And I know some 14-year-olds that that I might or might not be related to that could actually say that right now. But we know that's actually not the case. So the biggest thing that I know about this is that a CMM level 5 company that made it in 18 months, they have not had enough experiences, failures, problems to prove to me that they have the knowledge to get me around the potholes in the road and the mistakes that they made, because they haven't made enough on their own. So I want to deal with a company who took 5 or 6 years of hard effort to get to that level, and here's all the stuff that we learned from that, and this is how we can help you in it. And that only comes sometimes just with experience. So you can't just take that and reduce that amount of time. So I'm getting off on a sermon now, so I'm going to stop that. But I think it's about the journey, not necessarily the destination. So what are the SREs doing with their time? They're not just doing performance. They're not just trying to make code more efficient or applications more efficient, although that is part of their job. Their main thing is about reliability of an application. We want this thing up and running. Even if it's slow, we want it up and running. We want it to respond. And if it's down, we want to reduce the mean time to resolution to get it back up. So almost 70% of their time is spent doing that kind of work, which is what an SRE is supposed to do, is find it, fix it, automate it, and make sure it doesn't happen again. So they're spending a lot of time automating this toil out of the organization. That takes time. They have to be experts in fixing security vulnerabilities, so they have to have some security background. They need to know how to eliminate production failures. They need to know infrastructure. There's a lot of things they need to know, and unless you're that unicorn, I mean, that's a challenge, right? And then they need to make sure that they are instrumenting and setting up observability so they can find out the health of their system, and that takes time, that takes experience. My buddy Stephen Townshend, who switched over from being a performance engineer to a site reliability engineer just recently in the last 6 months, actually has a quote in this report that talks about this cultural change that needs to happen. And he mentions the documentation issue that I talked about earlier. And he says, documentation might not seem like an SRE thing, but when you build a practice around knowledge, if you don't put that knowledge down somewhere, you're going to run into issues. Could not agree more, Stephen. So thank you for putting that in there. So they talk about the role of an SRE need to have some time set aside so they can experiment with things to figure out how to make things better, and maybe even code some of their own internal solutions themselves. And I think that's a great idea. That's how new things come about. Did you know that in the early days of LoadRunner, when we were doing a lot of performance testing, there was a client of Mercury who said, we can create a script that does a load test with one user. And why don't we just take that and make it run every hour and get the same timings, but we'll point it to our production system and we'll do stuff in it that it won't tear anything up in production. We won't do any database writes but there's key things we might want to time. That was actually just thinking outside of the box and using something that wasn't intended for, and all of a sudden Mercury comes to visit and finds out they're doing this and go, you know what, that's not a bad idea. And from that idea, that was like the brainchild of what eventually became Business Availability Center. So you're using the same technology that you were using to load test a product, and now you're using it to get end user experience in production. Then they mixed that with SiteScope to get infrastructure metrics, and bada bing, bada boom, the APM market was born. And from the APM market, we have now advanced that into other things, metrics, logs, traces, all of these things together, this real user monitoring, end user monitoring, synthetic monitoring, putting them all together to create this, what we're trying to call the single pane of glass, and observe that. So that's what we're seeing in the market. They also talk about the number of tools in here that they're trying to use to monitor everything. And it is, it's because there's SREs are metrics driven. As they mature, they focus on how do we measure success. And there's 4 different metrics that they talk about: how frequently they deploy code, the lead time for any changes and get a commit into production, change failure rate, the percentage of deployments that cause a failure in production, and then how long does it take to get that service up. So those are some of the big KPIs that they're using to evaluate if they're successful or not. But then you have to, those are the good questions to ask. You have to set up the observability to give you that information and help you put it into that type of an answer for that question. Some of the biggest challenges: too many data sources, difficulty synthesizing all this different data, too many metrics, too many monitoring tools. And we're trying to set up these SLOs. How do we know what metrics to set up? How do we know what we should measure? And a lot of that is changing for each individual company, because this company who does software, and maybe they're a SaaS provider, they may have a different set of SLOs than somebody on an automotive production line monitoring software that does something for CAD or healthcare or anything like that. So managing, evaluating, creating SLOs is definitely going to be a challenge. So if you're a consultant out there and you consult with DevOps and SREs, being able to take a new organization and teach them how to create their own service level objectives with metrics that matter, that would be a good business to be in right now. There are 4 popular service level objectives that are mentioned in this report: availability, user satisfaction, also known as AppDex, error rate, and crash rate on mobile devices. Now they say the crash rate is the number of 500 errors, like 503 server busy errors. I wouldn't think that would just be for mobile devices. I would think that would be for any web-based application. You've seen me so many times with the 503 shirt, server busy. I love that code. So they just put mobile in there for that. Error rate, the ratio of failed request and total request per application. Availability, when the service is available to users, they want that 99.99999 if they can. The user satisfaction AppDex, I think I want to do a whole podcast on that, because my buddy James Pulley is like, I'm not really sure about this AppDex thing, because how do you define the satisfaction level based on the performance of the service? Who decides what is satisfactory? What do you base that on? And that can change, right? So we need to get into that whole AppDex topic on a different show. There are specific performance service level agreements, like utilization, the average time resources are busy; response times, obviously, the stopwatch timing for everything; how much demand is being placed, how much load is being placed on the system. So we still need to be doing load testing to find out that information, and what it looks like when certain amounts of volumes of traffic are affecting a system; the success rate of the total request; and how saturated the resources are. So how much memory is being taken up? How, is it leaking? How many CPUs do we really need? How do we optimize that? Especially for the cloud, that's going to be really, really important. So those are the main things that I got out of this report. There's a lot more stats in here. I highly recommend that you get this report from Dynatrace. And again, we'll have links on the show notes as well for that. So I want to move into the observability reporting now. And the first report that I want to go over is actually the newest report that was released just days ago as of this, as we recorded this podcast. It's from Splunk, and it's called the State of Observability 2022. So I'll have a link there where you can download that. This is 1,250 observability practitioners. So I didn't know that they had specific observability practice. I guess that's not a true title. I don't know of anybody who just does observability and sets it up, but maybe there is. Also, managers and experts to identify what observability brings to the table. Understand when we read these reports, who's putting out these reports and who's sponsoring these reports. I'm not so naive to not know that Splunk is obviously a observability platform provider. So maybe some of the conclusions they come up with are actually supporting what they're doing as an observability platform, so that you'll check them out. But I digress. I think you can figure that out for yourself. But they do have some pretty interesting stats and things that really confirm what we already knew, that if you're going to be a leader in observability and you do it right, you will find issues a lot faster, you'll detect them, and you'll be able to fix them. And hopefully, we're not talking about outages that are no longer, we never talk about days, and we don't even really want to talk about hours. We want to talk about minutes and seconds, right? So we want to get the outages to minutes per month or minutes per year. But those leaders who are actually doing that and are taking advantage of what observability has to offer, spend the time with it, they are experiencing like a 90% reduction in the number of outages that they have, and it's much quicker to repair them. And leaders in observability report a 69% mean time to resolution for unplanned downtime. I mean, that's a significant number. Another big point is that leaders, their cost goes way down for business critical internally developed applications, whereas the average cost for a leader would be 2.5 million. The beginner would be 23.8 million. A big difference, 10 times the cost when you're not doing it right. And the other thing is that they also note that just like with DevOps, observability is not something that is mature, and it's booming right now, but it's still got a long way to go. The way that Splunk defines leadership in observability is that they have 4 factors: 24 months with fewer than 12 marks, and they have the ability to correlate data across all observability tools. They have adoption of AI and machine learning technology within that observability tool set, which indicates a little more advanced. Doesn't say whether they're trusting the AI to actually make the changes or just report on what should be changed or addressed. But I thought that was interesting. So what it really looks like in this report is just like the 2018 Google State of SRE of who was advanced back then. You've got about a 10 to 11% of very advanced folks, and then you've got this 20 to 30% in the middle, and then everybody else, about 60% of the market, is beginners. Now, that hasn't really changed that much from 2021 to 2022. In fact, I saw that the leaders category went from 11% to 9%, and 9% was 2022. So there's about the same. It's like a point percentage either way on leaders, intermediate, and beginners. But most of the market, majority of the market, more than half the market, are barely beginning observability. So if you're into performance, especially if you're into performance monitoring, and you're looking into things like observability and AIOps, this would definitely be a good thing for you to learn about and prepare for if your company's not doing it, or maybe you're thinking about changing companies. I guarantee you this is going to be coming up in the next 6 to 12 months. It's going to cross your path. If it hasn't, I'd be very surprised if it didn't. So you're going to need to be looking into multiple observability tools, vendors, and platforms. So they break it all down into how they come up with, the leaders versus whatever. But here are some of the other things that I wanted to mention. They also talk about cloud complexity. We're not wanting to rely on one cloud vendor. So when we talk about multi-cloud, okay, very complex. We need more observability across that. We need to be able to take that information from all these disparate locations and again, try to create that single pane of glass. And so I think that's where vendors like Splunk and Dynatrace and others are trying to vie for your attention to say, look, we have the best visualization product. We can take all this data from all this stuff you want to look at, and we can compile it into a great graphic that you can quickly, or custom dashboard, whatever you want to call that, to drill into the problem and fix it as fast as possible. And some of them, if they're doing it right, are seeing that kind of result. So we're seeing, because these are all about the leaders now, which again, we're talking about 10% of the market. Of 1,250, there's about 100 of these companies that are saying 68% see they have seen accelerated development times, sending a lot less code, but they're having less failures. They're sending it more often, smaller changes, and if they need to roll back, they can. Accelerated deployment times, increased visibility across the different cloud providers, and accelerated problem resolution, which I think is key, especially when it's an outage or something is slow. So that's the biggest piece that just kind of confirms observability is actually being done in these DevOps teams. It's being done by SREs mostly. I mean, you can in a traditional role, I guess, in a performance engineer, if you're taking an APM tool and then you're starting to look at observability, it's sort of like this slow progress over to another. It's not like you're going to flip a switch and turn observability on and turn APM off. It's going to take time to do that, and I've heard as much as 3 years depending on how large your organization is. And if you want more information about that, check out the Performance Tour episode with Steve Flanders. It's episode 2. I actually interview Steve Flanders, who's with Splunk, as well as Rebecca Clenard, who they both work on the observability platform for Splunk. And Steve actually was talking about how long it actually took and some of the challenges that companies experience when they just are moving from APM to something else, or getting, especially like open telemetry, up and running and useful to them. Now here's the biggie, and of course this is Splunk telling you this, and so they're leading you to the conclusion of you need to use Splunk, right? But the observability tool count, based on how mature you are, if you are a leader and you have mastered this, most of these are using anywhere from 7 to 20 different tools, and it is split fairly evenly across cloud provided, open source, and commercial. So to me, if I'm Splunk, I'm going to say, look, we'll give you all the tools that you need, but just choose one vendor, us, to do it. That would be what I would sense from that. But that's still a lot. It's a lot going on, and I think that shows the whole immaturity of the observability market space. We've got to figure out how to simplify this, and it's complex, and it is so much data, and if it continues this way, we will just have to develop some kind of AI or machine learning algorithm that can take control and produce a much more reduced and condensed data set that makes sense to us. And we'll just have to be able to trust it, because again, people are already at the point where, I'm working all the time. I'm trying to make sense of this data. There will always still need to be people who can make sense of all of that data when the machines can't figure out the machines. Those skill sets will still need to be there, but it will be a different view a view of the state of that. So most organizations reporting here are increasing the number of tools that they're using. Very few are saying we're not doing anything. So everybody's doing something. They're also decreasing the number of vendors that they want to work with, which kind of makes sense. But again, it's coming from one of those vendors. Last thing I'll say about this report is what we also do. We keep hearing about the term AIOps, and I think that's probably another podcast as well, is to talk about what AIOps really is, who's doing it, what are the major players involved, and how successful are they. But one of the things that came up here is 71% of the people in this survey report using some kind of AIOps technology, either extensively, 34%, or in a limited fashion. So between the two, there's some AIOps going on, and most of them feel like like I just said, you kind of got one hand tied behind your back if you're not using some of that. So they need it to detect anomalies, changes that are happening, remediating incidents, and so they can focus on more automation and more problem solving tasks. So biggest thing for AIOps is letting AI figure out where the problem is at and get you to it as fast as possible. Other key thing is how you visualize that. So we will continue to see observability from a tool perspective and a platform perspective mature, as well as the organizations and their practices who are using it mature as well. And that leads us to the last report that I want to talk about. This one is from, I saw it from TechTarget, and this is actually from February 2022, and it's called Observability from Code to Cloud, and the people involved are Scott Sinclair and Rob Strecke. I hope I didn't mess your name up too bad. I did reach out to this group, and I actually reached out to them. I couldn't get a response, so I was hoping to have them on the show. Maybe if they see this, we can go over this report line by line. But there was just a couple other things that I wanted to add here. It just basically says that there is a near universal pressure being placed on organizations to accelerate operations, enter observability. As these practices expand, complexity and tool sprawl will increase, which is exactly what Splunk is reporting as well. And you're going to see AIOps and cloud cost optimization tools try to come to the rescue so that you can accelerate it and make DevOps operate and reduce the cost. So filtering out the things that you don't need to see and telling the right story. So I like this report, and I would recommend that you look at it. It's got some really good graphics, but it kind of tells us what we need to know, is that everybody is under pressure to find out as much information as they can and put it in a context that they can fix this problem. And I'm specifically talking about outages and performance issues, right? That's part. Now, there's a lot of other things that people will want to know about, but that is what I'm thinking about in my head right now, is this observability and monitoring is going to tell me, because slow is the new downtime. When I see things slow down, I think that's as good as down. I've got to start remediating that as quickly as possible. If an observability tool can get me there for this particular thing, I'm going to use that. If it doesn't have everything I need, I'm going to get another tool and add to it to fix that other problem. That's what you're seeing right now, and that's what they call that tool sprawl. So the other part of this is, I'm wondering if cloud providers will continue to expand what they offer with the cloud native metrics. You know, if you get on Amazon, that started out with just the AWS CloudWatch application, which would tell you some basic things that Perfmon might tell you. But in at least in the early days, if you said, okay, well, I want to monitor a Microsoft SQL Server machine that's up in the cloud. Yeah, you can get CPU, memory, disk, but okay, I want the specific SQL Server counters of that Windows performance monitor offers. Well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to actually set up Perfmon and open up some ports and still kind of do it the old-fashioned way. I think that has changed. I think there's other monitoring available that allows you to do that. But think about all the different monitoring that you have to do. It's the cloud monitoring, it's the network monitoring, the security, log analytics, code, end user experience. I mean, you start putting all this stuff together, and I mean, it just gets so big. So we are going to see companies that come along that say, you've got all this stuff, let me help you make sense of it. That's number one. Consulting organizations are going to help you consolidate your tool sets. I think that consulting groups are going to make a lot of money doing that. And there's going to be a whole, training wave around observability, much like we had with APM and load testing back in the 90s and early 2000s. But this is really this is a growing market right now. So it's exciting news for us as performance engineers, because this is right where we play. The problem is because SREs typically aren't specialized, you'll need to know all of that plus a lot of other things. And you hear me, waving the flag all the time and standing on the hill that says, I still think that we need to focus on this one area of performance, because it's just like I would if I was a security penetration tester or whatever. Security is its own special animal. Performance is its own special animal, and I think we need to think in those terms of specialization for that. Maybe I'm an SRE in a group of SREs, but I'm the performance SRE, and that's what I think about. I still think there's validity in that, and I'll argue with you all day. But these are some really good reports. And it's because it's by multiple vendors, they're coming to some of the same conclusions with different numbers of people. So even as the numbers grow to Google levels, we're seeing the same patterns. So I find that very interesting. I would like for you to do some homework for me. I would like for you to look at those reports and give me some feedback on what you think, and put that in the comments of either the video, contact me. Well, how would you contact me? If you want to contact me by email, you can reach me at help@scottmoore.consulting. But there's other ways as well. I've got a website. It's scottmoore.consulting. Can you believe that? How simple is that? There's a link to my LinkedIn profile, which I'm very active on. Shoot me a direct message there, or on Twitter at LoadTester. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, now would be a great time. And as of this, the print screen that I'm using right there was in the 600s, I think, when we first kind of started in January. Now we're like right at 1,000, and I'm like, that's just a magic number. It doesn't mean that I'm looking for monetization of videos or anything. It just means that when we get to that number, I'm gonna give something away. And by the way, just because you get to 1,000 users doesn't mean you're making any money off of YouTube. I think you have to have something like 1,000 hours a month of view time as well, and I'm not sure I'm there yet. But I do know others who are. And they're like, yeah, you're going to get a check for like $15. So that's not really supporting the whole show. So thank you again, sponsors, for supporting me on that. But again, reach out to me, give me feedback. I'd like to know what you think about the show. We're trying to put out 2 shows a week. I originally wanted it to be about 15 minutes. As you can tell, that's not going to work, because I keep talking, and we love talking shop here. So it's probably going to be 30 minutes a show anyway. So I hope that you don't feel like I've wasted your time. So give me some feedback whenever you like. Love to hear from you. That's today's show, the state of DevOps, observability, and SREs. I'm Scott Moore for the SMC Journal podcast, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.